My brother used my name to get a loan, then vanished, so I tracked him down, exposed his fraud, and watched his reputation burn publicly without a word. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and for most of my life, I believed family meant trust. Growing up, my younger brother Alex was always the wild card, charming, impulsive, the kind of guy who could talk his way out of anything. I worked long hours at a stable job, juggling bills, rent, and groceries, but I never hesitated when Alex needed help. When his car broke down last year, I paid for repairs. When his rent fell short, I covered the difference without a second thought. Even friends would shake their heads and say, "Man, he's using you," but I always brushed it off. I'd tell them, "He's my brother. I can't just let him sink." Alex had a way of making his problems feel urgent, his voice laced with guilt and charm. "I swear it's just this one thing," he'd say, leaning across the kitchen counter, eyes wide and serious. "I'll pay you back as soon as I get my next paycheck." I'd nod, handing over cash or signing off on small loans, convinced that I was helping him stay afloat. It felt natural, like part of my role in the family. I even caught myself giving him advice on budgeting and responsibilities, thinking I could teach him to be better, to be reliable. And for a while, it seemed like it worked. He'd promise. I'd trust, and life would carry on. But there were little cracks I tried to ignore. Unpaid bills, phone calls from people asking about debts I didn't know existed, and subtle mentions from friends that Alex had a reputation for bending rules and cutting corners. I'd scoff. "That's not my brother," I'd mutter. Deep down, I knew something wasn't quite right, but I chose to believe in him, to believe in us. Then one evening, as I was heading home from work, Alex called, voice tense and rushed. "Hey, I need a favor," he said. "It's just a small emergency loan. I promise I'll pay you back next week." I didn't hesitate. I trusted him, but something about the way he said it made a cold knot twist in my stomach, though I couldn't place why. It wasn't until a few days later that the nightmare started unraveling. I got home from work to a thick envelope from the bank, and the first words on the notice made my chest tighten. "Loan approval. Notice $25,000 under your name." My hands shook as I read and reread it. I hadn't applied for any loan. My heart sank, and my mind raced. Panic set in, a tight, suffocating kind that makes every sound around you seem distant. I called the bank, hoping it was some clerical mistake. Someone had mixed up accounts, something that could be explained away. But the representative's voice was calm, matter-of-fact, and merciless. "Sir, the loan was processed with your personal information and credit history. Our records show it was approved 2 weeks ago. You are responsible for repayment." My mind screamed. 2 weeks. That was the exact period Alex had asked for that small emergency loan. I felt like my stomach dropped into a pit I couldn't climb out of. I paced the living room, staring at the carpet as my thoughts collided. How could my own brother, my blood, betray me like this? I couldn't wrap my head around it. I wanted to scream at him, to call and demand answers. But every attempt I made, phone calls, texts, even tracking him on social media, ended in silence. Friends tried to warn me in the weeks before, but I'd ignored them. "Alex has always been reckless with money," one had said over beers. "Watch yourself, man. He's got a way of making people pay for his messes." I had laughed nervously, telling myself I knew my brother better, that this time would be different. I was painfully, embarrassingly wrong. That night, sitting alone, at the kitchen table with the loan papers spread out like a damning confession, I realized something I had refused to admit. Alex wasn't just in trouble. He was deliberately using me, my trust, my work, my life. He had weaponized it. Anger, disbelief, and a hollow betrayal wrapped around me like a vice. And then, through the quiet of my apartment, I whispered his name, bitter and trembling. Alex. Why, I spent the next few days in a haze, running on caffeine and anger, trying to process what Alex had done. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the sly grin he always wore when asking for favors, and my stomach twisted. I kept imagining him living it up somewhere, carefree, while I was drowning in a debt I never created. I decided I had to confront him, but when I called, there was only silence. I left voicemail after voicemail, my voice cracking, each word heavier than the last. "Alex, answer me. We need to talk. This isn't a joke. You can't just disappear." When my parents found out, I thought maybe they'd side with me, helped me figure out what to do, but their reactions split me in two. Dad shook his head, disbelief clear on his face, muttering, "I can't believe he'd do this to you." While Mom, ever the enabler, said, "You're overreacting. Maybe he had no choice. You should give him some time." I felt like I was standing on a battlefield alone, bullets whizzing past in the form of disappointment and betrayal from the people I trusted most. Friends who used to joke about Alex's antics started avoiding the topic, leaving me isolated. The more I tried to find support, the thinner the air became, and the weight on my shoulders grew unbearable. Meanwhile, clues about Alex's recklessness started surfacing everywhere. A coworker mentioned seeing him post a picture of a rented luxury car on social media the same week the loan had been approved. A neighbor texted me about packages being delivered to an address that wasn't mine but was somehow linked to Alex. Every tiny revelation felt like salt in a wound that refused to heal. I realized he wasn't just hiding. He was thriving in the mess he'd created, my mess. That night, I sat alone in my car, the city lights blurring through the windshield, and whispered to myself, a trembling mix of rage and sorrow, "I have to find him before it's too late." I couldn't just wait for Alex to surface on his own. The thought of him flaunting my identity, racking up debts, and disappearing while I was left to pick up the pieces made my blood boil. I started small, combing through social media, checking mutual friends, old contacts, anything that might give me a lead. Every like, every tagged photo, every vague post became a clue. I discovered subtle patterns, mentions of trips, posts from cafes I recognized. Even a friend who had casually commented, "Hey, haven't seen you in ages," and tagged a city 2 hours away. My pulse raced. It felt like I was closing in, even if he didn't know I was hunting him. The deeper I dug, the more reckless his behavior appeared. Alex wasn't just hiding. He was living extravagantly, funded by loans in my name and favors. He'd secured from people who had no idea he wasn't trustworthy. There were late-night messages from people I'd never met, debts stacking up, and evidence of his manipulation all over. Every discovery made my stomach churn, not just because of the financial disaster, but because the brother I loved and protected had weaponized my trust. Friends tried to warn me again. "Be careful, man. He's smarter than you think," but I couldn't stop now. I felt cornered and desperate, but also oddly empowered, like finally taking control of the chaos. The more I followed his trail, the more I realized Alex had been planning this for months. I could see how he'd crafted the small emergency story, how every move he made was calculated to avoid detection. And yet, there were crack-sloppy payments, loose ends, little hints that he wasn't as invincible as he believed. Every clue was a thread, and I was determined to pull until the whole web collapsed that night. Sitting in my apartment, surrounded by spreadsheets, screenshots, and notes, I whispered to myself, voice raw with tension, "I'm getting closer, Alex. And when I do, you're not walking away this time." I finally traced Alex to the city where he'd been staying, but finding him was another story entirely. Every time I thought I was close, a tip from a friend, a photo, a familiar hangout, he vanished before I could reach him. It felt like a game he was playing, one where I was the desperate player and he was always one step ahead. The panic bubbled in my chest each time I saw a glimpse of him from afar, only for him to disappear into a crowd or slip into a taxi. My hands shook, my jaw ached from clenching too tightly, but I couldn't stop. I had to see the face of the person who had betrayed me so completely. Even worse, evidence of his carelessness kept piling up. I saw posts online of him laughing in restaurants I couldn't afford, videos of him bragging about gadgets he bought on credit under my name. Every snapshot, every status update was a punch to my gut. He wasn't hiding quietly. He was flaunting my life, my identity, my work as if it were his own personal playground. Anger and disbelief twisted together inside me, making it impossible to think clearly sometimes. And yet, part of me admired his audacity. I tried reaching out to his circle of friends, pretending to be someone else just to get information. Some were cautious, others suspicious. But one acquaintance finally whispered a Lida-specific bar where Alex liked to unwind after a week of reckless spending. I felt a surge of hope, but it came with dread. I knew confronting him directly could backfire, but leaving him free to destroy my life wasn't an option either. That night, as the neon lights of the city flickered against the rain-slick streets, I whispered into the darkness, my voice trembling with fury and determination. "Soon, Alex. I'm coming for you. And this time, there's no escape." I was on the verge of exhaustion, running on barely any sleep, when I got a message from someone I didn't recognize. The text was simple: "I know where he is, but meet me tonight if you want the proof." My heart raced, part of me screaming that this could be a trap, but another part, a desperate, angry part, knew I couldn't ignore it. I spent the next few hours pacing my apartment, double-checking everything, my mind spinning with questions. Who was this person? Why help me? Could I trust them? Every scenario played in my head, none of them good. When we finally met, the truth hit me like a punch. The person had been one of Alex's own acquaintances, someone tired of covering for his lies in reckless ways. They handed me screenshots, bank statements, and messages, irrefutable proof that Alex had been orchestrating fraud under my name for months, and not just with the bank. My stomach sank as I realized how calculated every move had been. The brother I had trusted with my life had been living a double life, a life where my identity and hard work were just tools for his escape. The shock was overwhelming, but there was a flicker of empowerment. With these documents, I had leverage, a way to fight back without confronting Alex directly. But there was also fear. If I made a wrong move, he could vanish again, leaving my reputation and finances in ruin. I spent the night mapping out possibilities, planning each step with precision. And then, as I sat surrounded by evidence and trembling with a mix of anger and resolve, I realized the stakes were higher than I'd imagined. Alex's fraud wasn't just hurting MIT, was hurting anyone who had ever trusted him. I whispered to the empty room, voice barely audible over my own racing thoughts. "You think you're untouchable, Alex? But you've left a trail, and I'm about to follow it all the way." Once I had the proof in my hands, there was no turning back. I spent days compiling every piece of evidence: bank statements, screenshots of messages, posts he'd made flaunting my identity, and even small notes from people he'd manipulated. Each document felt like another brick in the wall I was building around him, a silent trap he didn't even know was closing. I printed, organized, and cross-checked everything, obsessively making sure there were no gaps, no mistakes. Every time I found another piece of his recklessness, a cold surge of satisfaction ran through me, mixed with the familiar sting of betrayal. But the more I dug, the more I realized how dangerous this was. Alex wasn't just careless, he was cunning. He had created multiple layers of deception, from fake accounts to alternative addresses, and he had networks of people unknowingly covering his tracks. I felt the weight of it all pressing down on me, the fear of one misstep undoing everything. Friends I tried to confide in were nervous, even wary. Sensing the storm I was about to unleash, I also noticed the subtle tension around him posts disappearing. Mutual contacts acting strangely, hints that he might sense someone was watching. It gave me a thrill and a chill at the same time. Every clue I uncovered was a step closer to justice, but also a reminder that he could vanish again if I slipped. That night, surrounded by stacks of papers and my laptop glowing in the dark, I whispered to myself, voice tight with determination and exhaustion, "Soon, Alex. Every lie, every trick, every debt you've left in my name is about to come crashing down, and you won't even see it coming." I thought I was close to regaining control, but that illusion shattered faster than I could brace for it. Out of nowhere, I started receiving calls from collection agencies, emails from creditors, even a formal notice from my workplace HR about suspicious activity tied to my accounts. My head spun, and my chest felt like it was being squeezed by invisible hands. It was as if Alex had anticipated my moves, setting up traps to drag me further down while he laughed somewhere untouchable. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly, and every time my phone buzzed, I flinched, expecting the next hit to land. Friends and family tried to reach out, but I was too ashamed and frustrated to explain. Every conversation felt like a minefield, people unsure whether to believe me or think I'd somehow messed up. Even the acquaintance who had helped me earlier couldn't protect me from the immediate fallout. My reputation, my finances, everything I'd worked for teetered on the edge of ruin. I felt utterly isolated, staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., asking myself how someone I loved and trusted could weaponize my life like this. Worse, Alex remained untethered and completely unaccountable. Anger and despair clawed at me in equal measure. I could barely focus, pacing the apartment, muttering his name, my throat raw from shouting at the walls. How can he do this? And get away with it? I whispered into the darkness, tears stinging my eyes. And then, amid the chaos and despair, something hardened inside Mia. I realized that if I didn't act strategically, I'd lose everything. I clenched my fists, jaw tight, staring at the floor littered with bills and notices, and whispered, I'm not done. Not by a long shot, and he's going to wish he'd never crossed me. After hitting that low, I knew I had to act but carefully. I couldn't let anger drive me blindly anymore. One wrong move, and Alex could disappear again, leaving me ruined. I started mapping everything out. Timelines of his fraud, the loans he took, the debts he left behind. Every screenshot, every witness statement. I contacted banks, creditors, and even some of the people Alex had scammed without them realizing it. Carefully showing them proof without revealing my identity too soon. It was painstaking, methodical work-like, assembling a puzzle where the picture was Alex's destruction. Every piece of evidence I uncovered added fuel to my plan. I realized how deeply Alex had woven his lies, but also how many threads he'd left dangling, mistakes I could exploit. It was almost poetic. His arrogance and carelessness were going to be his undoing. I spent long nights double-checking everything, obsessively making sure there was no room for error, no chance he could wiggle out of what was coming. Even the smallest detail mattered, an extra transaction here, a casual comment there, all adding to the narrative I was about to reveal. The more I worked, the more I felt both anxious and empowered. I could feel the tide turning in my favor, even though he had no idea I was coming. Part of me wanted to confront him directly, scream, make him feel the panic I'd felt. But I knew that would be impulsive. This had to be clean, calculated, inevitable. That night, as the city lights glimmered outside my window and rain tapped softly against the glass, I whispered to myself, voice low but fierce, Alex, soon everyone's going to see the real you, and there's nothing you can do to stop it. The day came when all the pieces were in place, and I didn't have to say a word. I'd sent the compiled evidence to the banks, authorities, and the people Alex had scammed, making sure every thread of his deception was accounted for. Then I waited, invisible in the background, watching the storm I had built quietly crash down. Within hours, I started seeing the fallout. Calls from creditors he had ignored, messages from people confronting him about loans and debts, whispers in social circles he had thought were loyal. He looked confused, panicked, scrambling, but no one knew I was behind it. I watched him in silence. Every frantic step, every desperate phone call, every lie he tried to spin, unraveling in front of the people he had fooled. Friends he'd leaned on for cover were now confronting him, their eyes sharp with betrayal. Even family members began questioning him, sensing the truth he couldn't control. I stayed in the shadows, feeling a mix of vindication and sorrow. This wasn't about humiliation for Mete, it was justice. Pure and simple. The surreal part was seeing him try to charm his way out, his usual arrogance crumbling. I could almost hear his thoughts. How did this happen? Who's doing this to me? But the truth was obvious to everyone but him. His time of manipulating, lying, and hiding was over, and I had orchestrated it without confronting him directly, without a single heated argument or betrayal from my own hands. That night, after witnessing the chaos, I sat alone with a glass of water, the city's lights reflecting in my eyes, and whispered softly, voice trembling, you wanted to disappear, Alex, but your reckoning found you anyway. After the fallout, the world seemed quieter, almost surreal. Alex's life was in ruins. Friends had turned against him, creditors were demanding repayment, and his reputation, once untouchable in our circles, was crumbling fast. I, on the other hand, felt a strange mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief because the nightmare he'd created under my name was finally over. Sorrow because the brother I had loved, trusted, and protected was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable. Family dynamics shifted in subtle ways. Some praised my strategy quietly. Others avoided me, angry that I had exposed him publicly, even without confrontation. I spent hours reflecting on what had happened, replaying the moments I had ignored, the warning signs I had dismissed, and the naive trust I had given so freely. The emotional scars were still raw, sleepless nights, constant anxiety, and the fear of betrayal haunting me. But I also felt a quiet empowerment, the kind that comes from reclaiming control over a life someone else tried to ruin. My finances were secure again, my reputation intact, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe without that suffocating weight. I realized that justice didn't have to be loud or violent. It could be meticulous, patient, and invisible until the moment it struck. Watching Alex face the consequences without me lifting a finger felt like closure I hadn't known I needed. I was proud of myself for staying calm, calculated, and above the chaos he tried to create. And even though the bond between us was irreparably broken, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. That night, lying in bed with the city lights spilling through the blinds, I whispered to myself, voice low but steady, I saved myself, and sometimes that's the only revenge that matters. By the time everything settled, I finally felt like I could breathe again. The fraudulent loans were cleared, my credit restored, and Alex's trail of deception had been fully exposed to everyone it had touched. I didn't need to confront him, didn't need to yell, didn't need to make a scene. His own actions had done the work, and I had merely guided the consequences. The freedom I felt was intoxicating. No more fear, no more sleepless nights, no more watching my life get stolen by someone I once called family. For the first time in years, I felt in control of my own story. The process left emotional scars. Sure, but also a clarity I hadn't had before. I realized how important boundaries were, how trust must be earned, and how dangerous it is to give too much of yourself to someone who doesn't value it. My family's opinion no longer dictated my worth. My own sense of justice did. I focused on rebuilding relationships that were healthy and reciprocal. Surrounding myself with people who respected me and my efforts, it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about self-preservation, empowerment, and finally walking free. I also had time to reflect on Alex, the brother I had loved so blindly. I understood that some people can never change, and no amount of guidance, loyalty, or sacrifice will make them see reason. The betrayal hurt, but watching him face the consequences quietly, without me having to stoop to his level, gave me a sense of closure that was deeper than any confrontation could have offered. That evening, I stepped outside onto my balcony, the cool night air brushing my face, and felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. I whispered to myself, a soft but unwavering vow. I'm done living for anyone else's lies. I'm free, I'm strong, and I'll never let anyone take that from me again.